So I want to say thank you for having me, and this is a great panel. And as you guys, with the precursor, this panel is really focusing on how do we change those perceptions of hiring individuals, formerly incarcerated individuals. And I like to think we have a little bit of an uphill battle because we live in a world where we are obsessed with crime. True crime, all sorts of crime. You know, I've done the doom scrolling at night where I'm like, oh, I'm doing better than that person. I'm not in, prison right now, or all these sort of circumstances that cloud our judgment when it comes to perception. I've joined several true crime podcast episodes. When P. Diddy, allegations for him, I went on my phone, I was like, oh, just obsessed. And so, part of that with our job is how do we change that? What do we focus on, and how do we get people to understand the real issues and really propel people forward? So I'm going to start with Awesta. And you are with the Small Business Majority, who has conducted research on what makes small business owners open to hiring justice-impacted folks. And for those that don't know, can you just explain what, I'll use the acronym SBM, and can you say a few words about the organization and what you've learned through your research, and including research practices sort of in the hiring space there?
Thank you. So Small Business Majority, we're a national small business education, advocacy, and research and insights organization. So we have about 100,000 small businesses in our network across the country, and we have about 1,500 to 2,000 business organizations, support organizations in our network as well. So we don't really operate like a chamber. People don't pay member dues to us. We're totally 501c3, and we offer free education resources to businesses. As part of that work, we do a lot of policy and advocacy that falls under 3 buckets of work. There's access to capital and opportunity, there's quality jobs, and then there's fair competition, level playing field, that kind of stuff. We really focused on criminal justice reform over the last few years for a handful of reasons. One of them being that across all of our policy issues, small business voices tend to be the most trusted voices among policymakers, no matter ideology. But 2, small businesses employ nearly half of the private workforce. And so there's a significant opportunity to do some education and policy work to support justice-impacted individuals. And we kind of come at the criminal justice perspective from 2 sides here. One being that there are a lot of entrepreneurs who have criminal records that face a lot of barriers, especially in accessing capital, and that's a whole other conversation that needs to be addressed because there's not a ton of research on it. And then we come at it from the perspective of educating small business owners on hiring justice-impacted individuals. So we did research, we've done a lot of research thanks to the Just Trust and Arnold Ventures. And one of the most telling pieces of research that we did was 2 focus groups among small businesses that was really interesting to get to witness. One of the big things we found among small business owners is they had initial apprehension around hiring justice-impacted individuals because of a handful of things. One, they were concerned about liability. They were concerned also about having to do background checks. For some businesses, they're required because they're part of a franchise. Industry is really important. I know that was touched on previously, and happy to get into it as well. But their minds automatically went to violent offenses. Like, it was never like there were nuances to convictions. It was like immediately, I don't want to hire a murderer or something like that. And instead, what ended up happening was when we prefaced a lot of the conversations with, we know small businesses struggle to attract and retain a workforce, it automatically changed the conversation. People were much more receptive because that is a significant struggle for businesses. Pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, it's always been a struggle for business owners. And so when we put it under this umbrella of, we know you're struggling with the workforce, and we have heard from plenty of small business owners that hiring justice-impacted individuals has really supported their bottom line, and specifically using that phrase bottom line, they were much more receptive. And then it became a conversation of, well, how long have they been crime-free? And there were some people who said in the focus group, Well, I guess if someone was, arrested at 17 because they were smoking marijuana, I guess it's not a big deal if I hire them for my trucking company or so on or so forth. So it really opened up the conversation when we were talking about addressing their bottom lines, and it made a big difference in terms of how they're perceiving crime generally, but also getting to specifics and getting down to brass tacks about, like, there's more nuances here that we need to discuss, and that was some of the most telling research we've done.
Got it. Before I go to the other panelists, I just want to follow up on one point. Through sort of the research and the conversations that you've been having to change those narratives, and I will echo in my conversations that I've had with folks about getting further into fair chance hiring, they immediately go to murder. And I'm like, why are you, wait, what? It's just automatically they go to the darkest place about sort of the narrative, and I have some thoughts too on research on changing that. But one of the questions I have for you is, did the concept of like economics come up in your conversations about lost wages and that it's not only good for your company but also just good for business within the areas and the communities? Did that ever come up sort of in your research?
It sort of came up at the end of the focus groups, honestly. People were really more interested in things like liability and how it's going to impact their business. They weren't so much worried about interactions with customers as they were about like financial liability. And a lot of the businesses had questions about, like, do I want to hire someone who might have had a record if I'm a child care provider? Because a lot of the folks in our network are child care providers, stuff like that. But where I think that did come up, we did a great event during Second Chance Month with our partners, Institute for Justice and RBIJ. And through RBIJ, a small business owner, Pete, who's over there, and I told him I'd name drop him. He hires a lot of justice-impacted folks. And he was talking about his experience, talking about giving back to the community, how it supports individuals in his community. All the questions at the end of the webinar were about that and to him. And it was one of the big takeaways I've had since the focus group, but also that experience is that not only are small businesses the most trusted voices among policymakers, they're the most trusted voices amongst one another.
Got it. So moving to Ken at the end, I'm LaToya Jackson. That's an inside joke. I shouldn't have done that, but he gets it. So Ken, in your previous role, you've worked with many companies on their background check policies, and while also urging them to open the door to more talent. So what kind of pushback have you seen sort of through your illustrious career of, what are you hearing from employers about not wanting to hire formerly incarcerated individuals, and, where do you think the data might go to sort of change this perception?
Well, both of you took my talking points. The number one thing that I've learned in working with companies and executives around fair chance hiring and open up that aperture. Can you hear me? Okay. The number one thing that I've heard and experienced and had conversations with when it comes to executives, HR officials, et cetera, is violence and violent felonies, right? By and large, if a company gets to me, chances are they've already kind of been touched at the heart. They already are curious about wanting to do it. They don't know how to do it, but they're interested. But the first thing that comes out of the mouth is, we're willing to look at anybody, but no violent felonies or serious felonies. And newsflash to folks, most people who are in prison have either had or have a serious or violent felony. Most people aren't going to prison for a bag of marijuana in America. Usually you're going to prison because you committed some type of act that could be classified as serious or violent. And really what's behind that is you have to really combat that with the data. And I'll just use data in California because that's where I'm from and that's where a lot of my work is done. When you look at people who have served life in prison for homicide, or other violent felonies like kidnapping, 15, 20 years or more, and this goes a lot to Sean's research, they have the lowest recidivism rate of any crime that's committed in the California prison system. So someone who actually steals or has a drug offense or is more likely to recidivate exponentially than someone who sat 20 years and went through programming, which Sean mentioned, aged out, as Sean mentioned. They have the lowest risk. But it's the hardest narrative to overcome. And so you typically have to spend a lot of time educating, which is why, There's several groups out there now that are doing workshops and teaching for long periods of time, companies, what all of that means and what it doesn't mean, right? But it's the biggest barrier is that violent felony, because people have these images that they've seen on Dateline or Snapped or all of the different crime shows that are on TV, and that's what we're combating against. Not realizing that those things that we're seeing on TV are not only sensationalized, but they're also anomalies in the scope of things. Now, a lot of people may wonder, like, why are people with violent felonies the least amount to recidivate? And that's because the data shows that most people who've committed violent felonies in their life, those are anomalies. Those are crimes of passion in their life. Most of the time, they don't have a lot of criminal history before, and they don't have a lot of criminal history after. They're circumstantial given, right? That's not the case all the time, but generally speaking, it is the case. So really combating and educating and informing people about what criminal justice reform is and what criminal justice is when it comes to people who have violent felonies, what it means and what it doesn't mean is typically how I do it, but it's a very arduous process. I've had to work with some companies 6, 9 months, up to a year, just to get past the violent felony piece. And oftentimes I have to remind them that if they have a blanket policy excluding violence, they're probably violating the law to some degree, depending on what state that they're in, because there shouldn't be a blanket policy against anybody. This comes up also when it comes to sex offenses, right? Whether they're violent or not. I've had a lot of companies talk about they don't want any sex offenses, right? And so working through that process is very difficult. Fortunately for me, I worked, many of you know, for Checker, and Checker, to their credit, like, didn't blanket reject anybody. They have several of their employees that have been to prison for long periods of time for a lot of these types of offenses, but they follow very strictly the EEOC guidelines, and if the charge or the conviction type doesn't apply to the job, if it's engineering or marketing or whatever, then they don't disqualify that particular candidate. So they really try to work with the mindset of that everybody who exits prison should be exiting prison with a presumption of rehabilitation. And that's what really a true second chance is, right? We've even hired folks who had a crime that was similar to the job that they were applying to and given that person a second chance, because really true second chances are about a true second chance. I mean, you clean the slate and they get to start over again, and the past is the past, and they've already paid their time for that and done all the programming necessary. So that's some of the obstacles that I see working with executives.
I just want to stay with you for another minute or so. So this education component, can you go a little bit further? Like, what have you seen that people have done to actually educate? Is this like through documentaries, through podcast? I'm kidding. I'm not. You do not need to speak up with the documentary.
She wants me to plug the documentary.
No, I'm just saying, like, our podcast. You know, I produced a podcast that was just highlighting folks who were, you know, talking about their employment journey upon release and what they went through to, like, get the jobs. And I have to admit, it became very eye-opening at Con Edison. So I remember our CEO in particular, there was one particular story where it was a young woman who was incarcerated, and she later in life, so she was an attorney, got with some bad people and ended up losing her license, and sort of it talks about how she managed to get employment. And I remember our CEO, I went to go meet with him, and I was telling him about the various stories, and he had listened to the episode, and I kind of wasn't expecting much, but he listened to the episode through and through, and he had taken notes, and his mind was like, this is wild, because we usually think about narratives, like Ken said, of like very, people that have committed very violent crimes, but that's not the whole that's not the whole story. And so my CEO was just illuminated on sort of the types, that happen to people and the circumstances that happen. So I'm just curious to know from your, what sorts of education that, goes on in the space.
Well, it's a both and. There's a lot of different spokes in the wheel of changing the narrative in America, building a new bottom up, a new bell curve. I mean, I wouldn't be able to speak about the education component without giving tribute to people who were in this room who taught me about the education component, which number one is John V. Martin from Dave's Killer Bread, formerly of Dave's Killer Bread Foundation, who introduced me to teaching this cohort model over 8 to 12 weeks and working with the Second Chance Business Coalition at the time to really onboard a lot of those executives in the legal department and the HR department and the DE&I department and teach them about things like violent felonies and what they mean, to go through the data sources and talk about all of the different things. And so I think, like, once you get a company interested, the key question is then the how. And most companies don't know the how. They're scared to death. Like they're interested in that story of the woman that you talked about. They're interested in the guy who's transformed and, you know, wants to become the next Larry Miller, who we'll talk about later tonight. But they don't know how to do it. And so who is going to fill the gap? Now, luckily, JFF, who's in the room, they're teaching companies all over the country on how to do it after they partnered with Dave's Killer Bread. I know Level Set does the same thing. There's other organizations out there that actually take organizations through a comprehensive learning journey on how to implement fair chance hiring and create change management within those individual corporations. But you get those companies excited through what you just mentioned as the storytelling, right? Conversations like these, if there's business owners who are interested in it that haven't done it, or at other conferences, they hear something at Harvard and they're like, oh, I'm really interested in that. Or they go into a prison visit, right? Like several CEOs in Silicon Valley going to San Quentin. Slack is one of them who got interested. Stuart Butterfield, Daniel Yanis from Checker, that's how he got interested in it. And when they get proximate, right? And that's the key piece of it, proximity, right? The only way you're going to get away from those TV images and the narratives we've been told about the boogeyman and everything else is when you actually meet human beings like me or like Kenyatta or the dozens of others that are in the room who are just as impacted. And once people get a chance to meet you and see the human side of you, it doesn't matter what crime you've committed. They're not even worried about that. They see Ken in a suit who's talking and articulating with a person. Now all of a sudden they forgot about what I did 30 years ago to go to prison. They don't even care about that. And that's, I find that to be the case most of the time when you're able to get CEOs and executives, as was mentioned earlier today, proximate to people and the issue rather than just talking at them about the issue. So that's how I learned about it.
No, I was going to say that's absolutely powerful. I think the power of storytelling, which is, you know, sort of one of the high level themes of this, and the humanizing it. These are people. We're all trying to, you know, make it in the machine, so to speak, in the matrix, to try to move forward. So Jeff, I'm going to Jeff. I'm changing gears right now. So Jeff, you ran for mayor of Philadelphia, and you've spoken openly about experiences in hiring individuals with records at, you know, the store, Brown's Superstores, and you advocated a lot for greater hiring of individuals with criminal records. So I want to know what did you hear from, you know, different types of people, especially from like the business community to the general public, on sort of your experiences of hiring formerly incarcerated individuals, and, you know, how did you change the narrative? Because you're sort of in the, you know, we're in the trenches, so to speak, of hiring folks and having to do a lot of narrative changing. So what did you do?
So can everyone hear me? Yes. Yeah. So just to give you a little more background, I'm a grocery entrepreneur. I started as a startup almost 40 years ago. And I first tackled the issue of food deserts. And food desert work brought me into impoverished areas that have high incidence of incarceration. And you talked about familiarity, and so I'm a hands-on guy in a small business. I'm with my customers, get to know them and their culture, their religion, and everything about, and they're humans now. They're not a statistic, and that does change things. And along the journey of doing that, I was opening a new store, and one of my customers said that there's a problem with your business plan because, you know, you're opening stores where a lot of people have been incarcerated and they can't get a job or they can't get a good job, and it doesn't sound like that ends well for you, and you should fix that problem. And I thought about it, and I thought the challenge was a good challenge. I didn't know anything about it. We hired our first 6 returning citizens, and we had a fairly good outcome, even though we didn't know what we were doing. And I think 5 of them are in management today from that original group 20 years ago. But 20 years later, we've hired thousands of people that have been formerly incarcerated. Thank you. And we started a nonprofit to train people that have records and have been formerly incarcerated. And we've had over 1,000 trainees, including we have contracts in the city of Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania to do the training behind the walls. So we literally have a sample size of many thousands of people. And this is an incredibly low risk activity. I have 20 years with thousands, and we have very few incidents that go bad, less than the general population. So we started a nonprofit to do it. I have my experience in business, and I was for 8 years chairman of the state workforce board, and, you know, have some policy experience on that. And I also work with the Obamas on developing the Let's Move campaign to address food deserts and worked on policy there. So a lot of experience. And what I told the voters when I was running for mayor, you're talking about a lot of different things, and none of those things have to do with the problem we really have. We're the poorest big city in the country, and when you look at the people that are poor, most of them have criminal records because they can't get a job, and you're solving the wrong problem. If we were able to train people that were formerly incarcerated, often that are undereducated and underexperienced to have meaningful work, and all those people got jobs, and we were no longer the poorest big city in the country, you would see every other problem gets better. And I think, and I'm still convinced to this day, I'm absolutely 100% right about that. And it's a problem for the country. It's just more severe in Philadelphia and Chicago and places like that. And not everyone jumped for joy with my observation. That there were some nasty Inquirer articles that they should know better. To think that my thinking was very shallow and uninformed. Someone who never dealt with this before and doesn't have proximity to the people. But what I knew that they didn't know is the people are good and they're smart. And a lot of times they have skills that are very beneficial to your business and society. And they're just not close enough to it to understand that the diamond in the rough or the untapped human potential that's there. And what you could do if you activated that group. Now, I definitely had people who thought my thinking was interesting. But it was so foreign to them, that I don't think they knew what to do with it. And of course, I did get into every other policy issue. But the truth of the matter is that we had a poverty problem. We don't have money because people can't pay taxes because they don't have a job. And if you fix that and we had money, we could fix all the other problems. I'm still convinced it's a huge national problem that's not looked at the right way. And once a person's not in poverty, the chance that their children will be in poverty is very low. If a person's in poverty, the chance that their children will be in poverty and be incarcerated, the chance is very high. So there's so many problems we have, from health outcomes. If you're in poverty and you live in a poor neighborhood and you also happen to be in a food desert, this all adds to an incredible barrier to change your life. And it's all part of a system that has a bad outcome. And it's all fixable because it's just a bad design. That's my perspective. Some people, like what I said, a lot of people, I was speaking another language.
I was going to say, I love what you said. But going along with that theme, I mean, it seems like this element of, which I think resonates with the business community, and it should, and folks that are getting further into fair chance hiring, is this point of opportunity. People need a chance and an opportunity, and that goes from people with records to people without records. If you're able to open the door to no matter what the situation is, you have no idea where the possibilities are endless. But when I sort of started on this journey of getting companies and like Con Edison and others to get further into fair chance hiring, I've always been a big proponent of, I personally do not have lived experience, but I have family and friends that have lived experience. And so I've always been very vocal about making sure they have a voice at the table and they're giving sort of input, because I am not the expert by any means. I have thoughts, but I've not had that lived experience. I'm curious, have you had moments to sort of elevate some of the workers and to have, that element of storytelling where they've been able to come out and speak about, sort of how working at the stores has been, sort of life-changing for them, and just adding that to the narrative?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what's interesting is, I was always the teacher to teach how do you succeed at work and in our society. But the truth of the matter is, my employees, and in some cases my customers, were taught me, why do they do the things they do, and how does it work in their culture or religion, and that's like the calculus of solving this problem: a greater understanding, a greater sensitivity to culture and differences, which has been an incredible business advantage that none of my competitors could touch because they don't have it, because they're not in the weeds with their customers like I've been. So when we started the nonprofit, I asked 3 of my most successful formerly incarcerated employees to come with me to talk to a funder to explain to them why we want to get what turned out to be a multi-year $5 million grant to fund the nonprofit. And I didn't coach them. I just brought them the way they were. They're very successful in management. And the funder was grilling, asking him a lot of questions about why are you so successful. And one of them said, I was like, maybe you would call me a drug kingpin. Like, I wasn't just a drug dealer. I ran a large organization with a lot of employees, and I have business skills. Mr. Brown helped me realize I could take those same business skills in sales, customer relations, inventory management, shrinkage, margins, and we call it different things, but it's the same thing. And I used that to parlay my success as a manager at Brown's, because it's the same thing, and it worked the same way. And that really opened my eyes, saying I didn't even think about it that way. It was a hidden gem of skills that I didn't even really existed. And so later we had all kinds of coverage, national coverage, and the workers did most of the speaking for me to explain the whole situation and history.
I mean, that's powerful, because you can take that away and people that are listening to those stories can understand. I think my whole point is, humanizing the aspect of this. So Amelia, you are coming with a very interesting, unique skill set, which I geek out a little bit because it's very interesting. So you are an expert in health and behavioral change communications. Can you describe your field and how it might, sort of get us to understand further about the perceptions and behavior in fair chance hiring?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just start really quickly with a definition of behavior change communication in case that's new for folks here. It's a field that's been around for over 50 years. It's well documented in literature, and it really believes and it aims to use communication to impact health and societal change. It's a systematic approach, so it starts with formative research, identification of communication objectives, message and materials development, testing, and dissemination, and then monitoring and evaluation. And it's been used primarily in health because for health, we are trying to get people to live healthier lives and make healthy decisions for themselves, for their families, and for their communities. But it's actually been used in many, many other fields, including in the justice field. So it's been used in particular for work related to recidivism. But from what I can tell, it's not been used for fair chance hiring. And I think what's so interesting, and I will be honest, this is a very new topic for me, but I've been so appreciative to learn from all of you today, and in preparation for coming here, I see both the deep challenges of this issue as well as gross opportunity here. And that makes behavior change communication very, very opportunistic, like a way of thinking or approaching communication for this field and for this issue. There are probably just lots of different frameworks and theories that come from behavior change communication. There's lots of risk frameworks, there's lots of self-efficacy frameworks. I wanted just to share maybe two with you all today as ways to kind of think about conceptualizing all of the data, all of the knowledge, and transforming it into, I think, narrative storytelling opportunities. The first is what's called self-determination theory. And what I like about self-determination theory is that it considers the social and cultural context within which an individual is making decisions for themselves. And there are lots of socio-ecological models out there that consider the environmental context within which we live, work, play, and worship. But for this one, what I like is that it focuses on three primary constructs, and that is autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And what I like about that is this idea of from an autonomy standpoint, being able to make decisions for yourself, to pay your bills, to take care of your family and your communities. From a competence standpoint, it's building new skill sets or leveraging skill sets that you have, which we just heard about, and being able to parlay those into new situations. And then from a relatedness standpoint, it's to feel connected to your community, right? To feel like you are giving back and participating. And so I think as it relates to hiring and workforce and being sort of being able to thrive, this theory is a nice one to consider because it really looks at how supportive environments are and how that leads to thriving or not thriving. And the second theory I'll just offer up is one that actually has to do with individual decision making. And it looks at behavior change as a spectrum from pre-contemplation. I'm not thinking about anything at all. I know nothing about it. I don't even know that it's existing. It's not on my mind. All the way to maintenance, where it's part of my everyday routine. It's part of my business practice. And while it sounds like it's on a continuum, what it really is a cycle, and that we cycle in and out of behaviors throughout the process. And so the act of changing the societal narrative around fair chance hiring is not a one and done. It's not one campaign. It's not one message. It is actually a continuous reminder of why this is important, of sharing the stories of successes from both communities, from people impacted in the justice system, and by employers. And so this idea of just continual reminders and communication is key. And I'll offer just a couple of reflections on some of the things that I read coming into today's conversation, which is there seems to be still a lack of awareness around this topic, just more generally. And a lot of, and I think you were sort of getting at this point, there's not a lot of the how, like in terms of like the skill building necessary, and that's leading to negative employment outcomes. There seems to be also this mismatch between what employers think communities want or are afraid of and what communities actually are afraid of. And that fact is that they're actually quite supportive of this. And that where there may be fear, that fear exists only in certain industries related to like certain cases where there might be employees who come from this background, and that once you share information about what this means for them, they can actually be very supportive. And from my awareness, there aren't that many communication initiatives, broad national initiatives to raise awareness of the importance of this issue. And so I think that like really thinking about our messaging as a field, as a community, I think there's a lot of opportunity here to do a lot more to raise awareness, to raise support, and to really sort of shift the narrative around this issue for our communities.
Got it. I know we're getting short on time, and I've been told I have like 30 seconds, but I must ask this question to you, and then I will pose it to another question to these panelists here. It's like the Apollo, so I'm not getting off this. It's not like the Apollo. I'm not getting off the stage. But Amelia, just very quickly, I know that some companies are getting it right, some are getting it wrong. Are there certain theories that you're just like, ooh, you should not be doing this at all? Like there's, certain models that, maybe some of us are employing at our own companies without us even knowing, that you would come in and say, stop that now, stop it, don't do it.
So I think this panel has done a lovely job of articulating the power of storytelling. Facts alone are not going to change minds. I can tell you that. In health, if facts alone change people's minds around health, we would not have the discussions that we have in health around what people want to do with their health decision making. Personal narratives, these are emotional decisions. As much as business owners want the facts, they want ROI, they care about their employees, about their communities, they care about their stakeholders. How does this impact them? And those are all emotional stories. And so I would say, if there's something you're doing and you're not finding success, I would look at like how you're messaging this. And it's not enough to say, here's what the data say. Here's what the data say, but putting the faces on those data and hearing from people who are either in those positions themselves, in communities that support, and or from employers themselves where they've seen success is incredibly powerful. And that's, I think, where we're going to start to see us be able to move the needle.
Got it. So I've been told if I do not ask this question, I will never be invited ever back to an event like this. So we'll start with Ken. The question for the whole panel is, based on everything you know right now, are there some research areas that you think that we should focus on in changing perception? And you only have 30 seconds, so I'm essentially having you solve climate change in like 30 seconds right now. So get to work.
I mean, for me personally, as a justice impacted person and understanding what moves the needle for my community, it's what this gentleman here said so eloquently and much better than I can say. It's about poverty. And whether you're Larry Miller or whether you're anybody else across the country, having a livable, accessible wage where you could have economic mobility makes a world of difference for a great majority of people. So the difference between making minimum wage and feeling the stressors of what's happening in the economy in a place like the Bay Area where I live, or LA where I'm from, or New York City or wherever, is exponentially difficult when you can't pay your rent, when you can't pay for transportation, when you can't survive and pay for your clothing and food and everything else, versus if you have a livable wage job and you now have a stake in the game and you actually have something to lose. That also weighs heavily, exponentially, on your ability to make decisions and the choices that you're willing to make and how far you're willing to go to make those choices. And so there's not enough data to show the correlation between what is the breaking point for somebody who doesn't see hope versus somebody who says, you know what, I have a stake in the game, there's nothing that you can do. You can't melt me down and pour me into jaywalking, because I'm not going to lose this $70,000 a year job that I have, and I'm going to take care of my kids and take care of my partner and be able to get a house, right? Those are some of the conversations that we don't hear in these rooms when we talk about recidivism or who does what and all the rest of that. I know a lot of people that are just as impacted, and I know a lot of people that have done a lot of crazy things that a lot of people in this room would be scared of. And I've seen the difference that a livable wage and having access to the economic mobility will have in someone's life, not only for that person, but generationally for their kids, for their future, and all the rest of that. And so I'd love to see us put together a study to show the correlation between wage and salary and recidivism, because I know that when you reach a certain threshold, recidivism goes down to like a super low single digits.
Got it. Thank you. Amelia.
Yeah, I would love to run a study to collect data on people's knowledge, attitudes, beliefs about fair chance hiring, both from at the individual level, at the community level, from amongst employers and employees, and also policymakers. And then I would love to create and test a whole bunch of messages and see which ones are the most persuasive.
I was going to say dope. Awesta.
I would say it's probably the ROI. For me, for the work that I do, I know small businesses would be that much more inclined to come to a state legislative hearing with me. The reality is like I've said this before, small business owners are trusted voices, but often they are wearing a million hats, and I can't show up with 50 business owners the way I would like to for a hearing. But if I can reiterate that this is beneficial to their business, that could make all the difference for passing some really instrumental legislation that addresses barriers and structural barriers.
Cool. Jeff?
So in my time in the workforce board, I talked to a lot of employers, and the question of how you get someone to a livable wage, is it a discrimination problem, or is it something else, or some combination? And in my experience, if you train people on soft skills, you know, how you communicate, how you dress, showing up for work on time, these things, which every business I talk to says that's their number one problem, getting someone who has those basic soft skills. And you train them a little bit on hard skills for a job that pays well, like the problem just goes away. And so the research I would like to see is what is the delta between someone who's had soft and hard skill training and the non-intervention group. And I think you would quickly learn that if this country could only teach people, like you can't leave high school till you learn soft skills and you decided some things you are interested in that we could teach you how to do that pay a living. And this is not that complicated, and I think our mind goes in a lot of different directions, which doesn't really have an answer or a solution. The answer or solution is, don't come to work with your pants around your knees. That's not going to get you a job. Don't come late. Late is not going to get you or keep you a job. And these basic things aren't complicated. We could teach everybody in this country that, and you would see wages skyrocket, because there's a massive number of openings and a massive number of unemployed.
I know we're at time, but I would say my research question revolves around what Ken mentioned earlier about sort of further thinking about how do people actually end up in the justice system. So I think about this all the time, and I live in Brooklyn, so I'm in a tiny room, which you guys would be like, that looks like a bathroom, but it's my living room. And I think about sort of, the categorizations of the types of crimes that we're dealing with. Are these people that are intending to commit a crime for some sort of benefit? So I think of like Pablo Escobar, serial killers. These are things that we as people don't fully understand why they're doing this, but they're exploiting the system in some sort of way. Then there's the second category of people where they are, are they purposely violating the law because they're in a vulnerable state. So I think of people, maybe they're selling drugs, but that's to support maybe their family or to just live. And then there's a third category of people which you don't even know you're violating the law, but you are. So I worked on this racial profiling case in Maryland, and we did this whole study about drivers driving down the road. And it turned out, it's some crazy statistic, I think from our study, it was like 100% of the people driving down the highway are committing a crime at any point in time. Either you're driving too close, you're going too slow, you're cutting people off. All of these are violations, but you may not get, a ticket, or you may not, in fact, be part of the justice system because of those things. And so that's sort of my research to really nail down on, how are people actually ending up in the system, to really focus on that data, because I think it might be able to change minds. I think I'm done. Oh.
Go straight to discussions, or do you think we have time for questions?
Oh, it's a good one.
All right.
So make it great, people, or everyone will be sad at you.
I'll go first, if you don't mind. Hi, Michelle Crunty with JP Morgan Chase. And one of the things that I find fascinating in the work that we do, as well as others, is really the demand signals and the impact of the stories being told by the employers to be able to do that, that also encourages people to actually aspire and seek those opportunities to be able to do that. And we often talk a lot about the ROI or what it looks like, but as soon as people in the neighborhood started hearing about new hiring people that were just as impacted, and the power and the careers that they were starting to build, I bet you had lines outside the door of people who wanted that same opportunity. We've experienced that same thing, and so I just wonder why there's limited research on that connectivity around that.
I have no idea why you guys are staring at me. You're the panel. I'm just moderating. So someone step up, answer.
I mean, that's a really great question. Unfortunately, I think there's limited research in just about every aspect of this work, which is why we're all in this room, right? And there's literally like 1,000 threads that lead to some type of solution that we're thinking about, but there's scant research, right? And so the hope is that we emerge from here and we decide as a collective collaborative body to engage with whoever, whenever, to create that body of research, which is going to inform how we push policy, which is going to inform how we influence CEOs and the Business Roundtable and others.
I'll just add, I also think there is this us versus them mentality that a lot of people have, but business owners have too. When we did a survey earlier this year about community safety, small business owners in their communities felt like safety was not a concern, but nationally they felt like safety was a huge concern. And it reminds me of when I argue with my sisters who I don't live near. I'm like, they're in Maryland and they're scheming against me, and I assume the worst of them. And then when I get in front of them, I'm reminded that oh no, I love this person, and it's the personal connection.
I mean, do you? Or a little bit of a sharp response
Not
there.
today, but it's sort of that as well. It's the personal stories and the community that you're in. So if we can get business owners to stop getting into the us versus them mentality, and just because someone's in another state or another community within their state doesn't mean that they're bad people. It's purely that storytelling that makes the difference.
All right, I think we're going to transition to our table discussions. One more round of applause, please. Oh.
One quick comment. Ken says there's not a lot of research. And Ken, you're wrong. But he's right that a lot of people in this room don't know a lot about the research that is currently existing. There is a gap. And I'm sitting here listening, and I know a bunch of the answers can show you the papers, but the reality is in this particular space, the research hasn't connected very well. And so I think it would be more helpful if instead of saying there's not a lot of research,
Types of research matter.
there's a lot of research on a lot of different techniques, including ethnographies, including on the question that she asked. And so I think I've heard this, the only reason why I jumped up, besides I'm a jerk, is that I've heard this before. I've actually been in a room, a small group of people with employers, and someone stood up and said, there's nobody doing research on this topic except Jeff Korsnick. I'm sorry, Jeff's a wonderful guy, but that's not true. And there's a lot of people in this room who are doing research on this who can really help illuminate these issues. And the questions that you're asking are actually being answered right now in ways that could be helpful for the discussion we're having. And so I think we need a better way to communicate that and get that out there, because it is not true that a lot of the questions that you're asking don't at least have some information that will help you make progress in that space. Sorry.
I was just going to say, Ken, are you okay?
Fine.
Okay. I'm checking in. This is circle of trust and safety, right?
Thank you. One more round of applause for the panel.